this family going out of business and losing their livelihood. If there is one thing that I would encourage you to do, amidst all of the things that you plan to do, there's one thing that I could add to your list. It's to challenge that kind of thinking every time you encounter it. Every time you hear somebody say that they are voting against their own interests, I urge you to challenge that. Challenge that thinking. It is so incredibly important to do so, because those rural voters, those neighbors of mine from my past years, they are not voting against their own interests. They understand their interests well. Yes, many of them, not all of them, maybe not even that farmer from Westby who they said deserved this fate. Maybe he didn't even vote for Trump. They didn't all vote for Trump, but some did. But whenever you encounter that thinking, I do encourage you to challenge whoever says it by sharing one simple fact. And that's the result of the 2008 and 2012 elections. Because dozens of rural counties in Wisconsin and hundreds of rural counties across America voted in 2008 and 2012 to make Barack Obama the nation's first black president, and then put him back in office 4 years after. And if all of this can be explained by people voting based on bigotry and racism, how do you explain the results of the 2008 and 2012 election? I think one of the things we've got to come to terms with is that those voters, and I'll tell you, like I said, we traveled 100,000 miles over the course of 11 months. I met more Trump voters than I can count. And I'll tell you this, there are no two exactly alike. I had so many conversations with Trump voters, and I never met two alike. They are complicated. And they got lots of different reasons for why they have been voting as they voted. Why they voted for Donald Trump, but voted for Barack Obama before that. And I ran into people who voted for Bernie Sanders in the 2016 primary election and then turned around and voted for Trump. This is a complicated bunch of people. But what I did find was a common thread, and that is they are voting out of desperation. They are voting out of frustration. They are voting out of anger. They are voting in hopes that maybe they can get the attention of people in Washington, D.C. or in state capitals around the country who they don't think have given them a second thought in ages. They even wonder if those politicians even know they're out there. But they feel written off. They feel forsaken. They feel as though they don't even matter. And that angers them. And I think it's so important for all of us to understand what a thin line there is between hope and change on the one hand, and fear and hate on the other hand. It's a far thinner line than you might think. And instead of responding with sanctimony, instead of responding by putting them down, we've got to, I think, respond with empathy, to understand the frustration, the anxiety, the desperation that so many people out there are feeling, and why that does drive them to see Barack Obama as maybe a way out of the mess that's been created, then maybe see Bernie Sanders as a way out of the mess, and then finally maybe take a flyer on somebody like Donald Trump. And instead of hating them, we need to seriously try to understand where they're coming from. And again, that's where I consider it such an amazing blessing to have been born and raised in a place that now votes overwhelmingly Republican. My hometown, those of you who've heard me speak before, probably heard me say this before, but my hometown had the distinction in the governor's race before this last one. Curtis had the distinction of giving Scott Walker his biggest percentage margin of victory of any community in the entire state of Wisconsin. Scott Walker won my hometown with 90% of the vote. And I consider that a blessing to have been raised in a place like that, because what I found is that their concerns, their way of thinking is not so terribly different from any of ours. I relate to what they are struggling with. I understand how they're thinking. I come to different conclusions than they do, but I get I get the burr under their saddle. I understand it. And to me, that's a great blessing. And we need to open our hearts to people, because we can condemn them. We can say you're just stupidly voting against your own interests, and that's condescending as hell. It's also wrong, but we can say it to them. But ultimately, we need their votes. Ultimately, we need them on our side. And they have shown that they are willing to be on our side, and they've voted with us at times. And we've got to give them more opportunities to vote like that. We've got to give them more opportunities to side with us. And it's not going to help by telling them that they're stupid or that they're foolishly voting against their own interests, or condemning them the way that they get so often condemned. When I printed these comments out, I have to tell you, it shocks me that people think this way. But it shocks me a hell of a lot more that they're willing to write it down and put it out there in public. But here's what I can tell you. If you think that way, if you share those views, even if you don't say it out loud, people in places like where I'm from, they know that you think that way about them. I don't know how they know, but they know. They can feel it. They can tell. Maybe it's the tone of one's voice. I don't know what it is. But they know how they're seen, and that only drives them further away from us. We can't afford that. We absolutely cannot afford that. So when I hear somebody say, I don't want anything to do with Trump voters, they're evil, that to me is heartbreaking. Because so many of those Trump voters were at one point Obama voters or Bernie Sanders voters, for crying out loud. They are searching for something that they're having a devilishly difficult time finding. Our job is to give them more opportunities to find what they're looking for. So that's one thing that I would challenge you to do when you run into that viewpoint. And it is a common viewpoint. You hear it's become an article of faith on the Democratic side that rural voters are stupidly voting against their own interests. Challenge it. Ask them, how do you explain 2008 and 2012 when dozens of rural counties in Wisconsin voted for Barack Obama? How is that possible if what you say about these people is true? And having grown up on a farm and waking up and going out to the barn at 5 in the morning, and you get out of the barn at 8 o'clock at night, and you're doing this 7 days a week. And my dad went a 35-year stretch without a day off. And then I go out to a farm near Gays Mills while I was out on the campaign trail. And I had a chance to spend some time with the Swert family, John and Lois Swert, from the Gays Mills area. They're dairy farmers, but not only are they getting up at 5 in the morning and getting out of the barn at 8 o'clock at night or so, but Lois goes off and works in an apple orchard to try to earn some extra money for the family, and John is fixing his neighbor's machinery on the side, working as a mechanic, again to try to earn some extra money, and they look to me to be broken. It was unfathomable to me, knowing what farm life was like, knowing what the work was like on a dairy farm growing up. It was unfathomable to me to think about doing all of that work and then having a side job on top of it. And they looked like they understood they weren't going to make it. And how anybody could put themselves in those shoes for even an instant and then condemn them for the frustration and the anger and the anxiety that they're feeling is totally alien to every fiber of my being. We have got to make allies in places where we now only see enemies, or we are screwed as a state and as a country. And in so many ways, America is screwed. But it's our job to unscrew it. And I just ask you, do you really have faith that it's going to be state legislators or governors or presidents or members of Congress that are going to unscrew our country? No, it's going to be up to us. The answers are going to have to come from we the people. And so I do ask you to challenge that kind of thinking whenever you encounter it. It's so terribly important that we do that. The last piece of advice, the last suggestion I'm going to give you, and then we'll just open it up and turn this into a two-way conversation. But one other thing I want to say. There is such a long list of things that we've got to deal with. Economic inequality, global climate change, the crisis in farm country, the fact that you've got a state that leads the nation in incarceration of African Americans. We've got the zip code in our state that has the highest incarceration rate in our nation for African Americans. We got so many things that we've got to deal with, so many problems that we've got to solve. But so this is going to sound strange, but I think one of the most important things that we need to do is we need to learn how to lose with a purpose. We need to learn how to become better losers. I understand that sounds strange, but and don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that we should lose on purpose. I'm saying that we need to learn to lose with a purpose. Losing purposely, to me, is our salvation. And if you all involved with our Wisconsin Revolution will take a piece of friendly criticism, it does speak to this idea of losing purposefully. In the last race for governor, our Wisconsin Revolution endorsed one candidate. And that was in the general election. OWR endorsed Tony Evers, who was easily the least revolutionary candidate in the field. A centrist, easily the most centrist, most middle-of-the-road candidate in the field, easily the least revolutionary candidate, and our Wisconsin Revolution put its endorsement behind the general election nominee for the Democratic Party, but chose not to weigh in during the primary season when you could have taken a stand for a far more revolutionary, far more assertive kind of candidate. And perhaps Tony Evers still would have been the nominee. But that's where I think it's so incredibly important to realize that long before you will ever win, you will lose many, many, many times. Before you ever back a winner, you will have to back many losers. But there is a difference between losing and failing. It is not a failure to push centrist candidates to embrace a bolder agenda. It is not a failure to force the process to open itself to ideas that have been previously pushed aside. When you think about it, your organization formed out of the failure of the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign for president, except it wasn't a failure. It wasn't even remotely a failure. There was nothing about it that was a failure. Bernie Sanders did not become the Democratic nominee for president, although I am absolutely convinced that had he been the nominee, he'd be in the White House today. I believe that with not even a shadow of doubt. If he had been the nominee, he would be president today. The only path Donald Trump had to the White House ran through an establishment opponent. The only way he could have been elected president is if he faced an establishment figure in the general election. And one was served up to him on a platter. But be that as it may, how can Bernie Sanders' effort be considered a failure when just take one of his stands, just one of them, Medicare for all? That was a fringe issue in 2016. Democrats didn't want to talk about it. The Democratic nominee at one point was quoted saying, "That will never happen." Never is a very long time. Medicare for all will never happen in America. That was the official position of the Democratic nominee for president. Listen to all the candidates this year in 2019, just a few short years later, how many of them have embraced Medicare for all, how many of them are talking about it. This is now a mainstream issue, even in the mainstream media. Medicare for all is being talked about. That is an incredibly important victory. And that's what happens when you are willing to lose purposefully. Not lose on purpose, but lose with a purpose. To drive the conversation to a place it's never been. To force candidates to talk about things they'd rather not discuss. That's what it will take. Long before you ever are able to back a winner, you're going to have to support candidates who fall short many, many times, but who will change the conversation. Just as Bernie Sanders changed the national conversation on health care. That's incredibly important. So I just plant that seed. With all of the important issues and causes that we need to concern ourselves with, I think the most important thing that we can do is think about how to lose, and how to lose the right way. And just to drive home this point, I want to remind you about something. This is the 100th anniversary of women gaining the right to vote. The 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, was ratified in 1920. So we're coming up, and Wisconsin did it in 1919. So in our state, we are celebrating the centennial of women's suffrage. By 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified. It is worth remembering that so many of the suffragists who not only marched, but were in some cases beaten and imprisoned and tortured in jail, never lived to see the 19th Amendment ratified. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, all passed away more than a decade before the right to vote was won. In Stone's case, Lucy Stone died more than 25 years before the 19th Amendment was ratified. Those are the famous ones. Rowena Grant of Steele died in 1901, but not before her novel, The Victims of Fate, became the first novel written by a woman to be published in the state of California. Esther Hobart Morris became the first woman justice of the peace in the U.S. in a small town in Wyoming. She died in 1902, 18 years before the right to vote was won. Helen Pitts was probably best known as the second wife of Frederick Douglass. She died in 1903. Never lived to see the day when women had the right to vote. Sarah E. Wall led a successful anti-tax protest in Massachusetts, defending a woman's right not to be subjected to taxation without representation. She died in 1907. So she was defending a woman's right to not be subject to taxation without representation more than a decade before the 19th Amendment was ratified, giving women the right to vote, a monumental achievement that she never lived to see. And then Julia Ward Howe, best known for writing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, she died in 1910, a full decade before women won the right to vote. All of those people, and dozens and dozens and dozens more with similar stories, fought and marched, and in some cases were jailed and beaten and tortured in jail. And they did it without ever experiencing victory, the victory that they wanted. But how can any of their efforts be seen as a failure when you look at history and have the benefit of that hindsight? That is something that we all have to keep in mind. We all have to be willing to take that stand, even if it means losing again and again and again and again. We have to be willing to take that stand if we're going to make the kind of change that will eventually pave the way to the kinds of victories that we want to see. And that, to me, is what our Wisconsin Revolution has to be all about. And so the biggest thing, I think the biggest, most important single ingredient to making change has got to be nerve. It takes nerve to be willing to stand and be beaten down, to run and lose, to wage a campaign and be defeated, sometimes time after time after time. But it is the way change gets made. And so we gotta get over this hang-up that we've got about losing. And get over this hang-up about wanting to be on the side of whoever is going to be the likely winner. And we got to stand for those who will, in fact, drive change. That's so incredibly important. And let me just tell one last story, and then we will open it up and turn it into that two-way conversation that I promised. But I had a chance to talk with some gay rights activists from Minnesota. Shortly after Minnesota became the first state, after a string of defeats in state after state, it became first state to win a statewide referendum in favor of marriage equality. Wisconsin, if you recall, had gone in the opposite direction, and we actually amended our state constitution to define marriage as an act between one man and one woman. And in our Constitution outlawed the idea of gay marriage. And state after state after state was doing the same thing as Wisconsin. And those gay rights activists had to be incredibly discouraged and downhearted and frustrated and about ready to throw their hands up because they were losing everywhere all across the country. And then all of a sudden in Minnesota, they win a statewide referendum in favor of marriage equality. And I had this unusual opportunity by chance to talk to a number of the activists who had led the organizing for that campaign. And I said, how the hell did you do it? You're our neighboring state. We amended our Constitution to ban gay marriage, and you did the exact opposite. How did you pull that off? And it was fascinating what they said. And if any of you are fans of the NPR show Hidden Brain, Chandra Verdantam has this wonderful segment of Hidden Brain that talks about this very thing. And I encourage you to look it up and get the podcast about how gay rights were won. What these activists in Minnesota told me is we had always treated our issue as a civil rights issue. We had always made the case that we're different than the rest of you, but we demand equal treatment. We're different, but give us equal rights. And they said we decided to stop doing that. And instead, we decided to talk about our issue in terms of love and marriage and commitment and family. Interestingly, what they did is instead of saying we're different than you, but we expect our rightful place, they said, we're exactly the same as you. We fall in love. We get into committed relationships. We would really like to seal the deal by getting married. That's what you all do. That's what we would like to do. And it seems to have melted hearts across the state of Minnesota. And of course, you know the rest of the story. Not long after Minnesota won that statewide referendum, the United States Supreme Court rules making marriage equality the law of our entire land. That happened in such a breathtakingly short amount of time. From a country that was adamantly opposed to extending marriage to a relationship beyond that between one man and one woman, to a country that is now embraced marriage equality. That is an astonishing change in such a short period of time. And how did they do it? They did it by reaching across the divide and saying, we got something in common with you. We're like you. There's nothing different about us. We get into relationships, we fall in love, and we want to get married. And the Minnesota activists even used that 1950s song, Love and Marriage, as their campaign anthem. You know the song, love and marriage, go together like horse and carriage. That's what they used to drive that point home. And they won. And we can win too. If we are willing to reach across divides, if we are willing to stop demonizing people who we see as enemies but who are not that terribly different than us, we're all human. We need to cut each other some slack. We need to get to the point where we act out of empathy and not out of spite. And if we do that, if our Wisconsin Revolution can do that and can absorb enough defeats before the victories start coming, we can not only remake Wisconsin, but we can remake America. Thank you so very much for coming tonight, caring enough about this, and giving me a chance to share this thought. Your turn. Whatever you want to ask about, fire away.
Okay. First of all, if I sound snitty, it's just because this whole issue frustrates me. So I agree with everything you said. Okay?
But.
Yes, there's a lot.
There's a but.
That's why I had my hand up. You haven't given me any information. You haven't given me any new information. You haven't told me what they see, the people in the rural areas see as their interests that somehow are supported by Trump.
Happy to.
Please,
Yep.
give me as many as you can.
Yep.
I'm writing them down.
Let me start this way. My dad was a dairy farmer. He grew up on the farm, lived his whole life on the farm, had an 8th grade education. So he was not a learned man by book standards, but he knew the ways of the world. He made it through the Depression, lived through the Depression, fought in World War II in some of the bloodiest battles in that war, saw a lot, experienced a lot in his life. He was a lifelong Democratic voter, really shaped by one man, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That's why he was a Democrat. And the whole rest of his life, my dad would judge every single candidate he voted for by the extent to which that candidate reminded him of FDR. And when you think about FDR and the New Deal and what made my dad a Democrat, think about, for example, rural electrification. My dad lived through rural electrification. He was alive at the time, born in 1919, he was alive at the time when electricity didn't make it out to every rural household. And Democrats, under the leadership of people like Franklin Roosevelt, brought electricity to every single barn and every single farmhouse, down every single back road across the entire country. That revolutionized rural life. It revolutionized farming. I don't know if any of you have milked cows. I've milked a lot of them in my life. It's really hard milking cows by hand. It is so much easier milking with a machine. You can milk so many more. Electricity made it possible for dairy farming to be revolutionized. That's the kind of thing that made my dad a lifelong Democratic voter. Now, fast forward all these years. You drive down the road where you'll find our old farm is still gravel to this day. Still not paved today. You can drive down that road and you will indeed see electric wires going to every barn and every farmhouse all the way down that road. But you will not be able to get an internet connection and you will not be able to get an old phone signal. The 21st century needs of communities like that are not being addressed the way the 19th and 20th century needs of those communities were met by the likes of FDR. And so people in those rural places, I think the calculus that goes on in their heads is that government really doesn't even care about our needs and is doing nothing to help us. And if government is not going to do anything to help us, then it's in our interest to keep government as small as possible and keep taxes as low as possible, because that's the best we can do. Now, if you believe that government is useless to you, and you concluded that the best you can hope for is to keep as much of your own money as possible and keep government as small as possible, what does that make your default option in election time? Which party has aggressively marketed itself as the party of less government and lower taxes? I think it may be frustrating. It wasn't my choice. It's not how I chose. But I totally understand people who went from being loyal Democrats who migrated to the Republican Party. And to me, the answer is for a better offer to be made to those rural communities and say, we are going to bring internet to every doorstep. We are going to make sure that you can get a mobile phone signal anywhere in this country. That would be the kind of thing that would make them think, wow, government actually is useful. Take our roads. I mentioned that I grew up on a gravel road. But even the paved roads, we've got small rural townships digging up pavement and replacing the pavement with gravel because they can't afford to keep filling the potholes. Now, how many trips to Madison or to Milwaukee does it take to see a Badger game or a Brewer game or a Packer game? How many trips does it take to the city for a rural person to notice all of the traffic circles and the interchanges and the clover leaves? And they're thinking, well, that's where all our gas tax money's going, and we can't afford to fill our potholes, and we're going back to dirt roads. Of course that creates resentment, and of course that creates frustration, and of course it drives them more to the position that we should just get government as small as possible and keep our taxes as low as possible. That is the best we can possibly hope for. That's not the way my dad thought, because he saw tangible evidence. He could drive through any little town, and he would actually point to things, and he would say, that was built by the Works Progress Administration, that was the Civilian Conservation Corps, except he didn't name the agencies. He would just say, that was WPA, that was CCC. He could, I guarantee, he'd go through any little town, and he could tell you which project was WPA and which was CCC. And that filled him with love for Franklin Roosevelt, because he knew that Roosevelt had put people to work in all those small towns, building things, building up their communities. That's all gone. That activity is not happening anymore. And so I can't personally be all that judgmental. I can't bring myself to blame those rural folks when they say, just keep government as little as humanly possible and keep my taxes down, because it's all going to the cities. Nobody cares about us. And when I look at the tangible evidence, I think, I can't really blame you for feeling that way. It's our job to give people in those communities a reason to believe in government. They've lost that faith in the value of government, and it needs to be reinstilled, not through words. You can't go out and lecture them about how important government is. We have to show people how important government can be. They haven't seen it in a long time. And you know, they're living in communities where in farm country, the rate of suicide is as high as anywhere in the nation. Right here in Wisconsin, we've got farm foreclosures. We're losing 3 family farms a day. When those family farms go under, the small towns that used to be supported by those operations start to dry up and blow away, people are terrified out there. And they're not seeing a government response that makes them confident that trusting in government is worthwhile to them. So that would be reason number 1 that I would offer to explain why what appears to be an act of voting against one's own self-interest is actually, they understand their interests very, very well. And the way they calculate it, their interests are not being served by what they perceive as the party of government. Yeah?
Oh, how can you explain the loss of small farm or small family dairy farms and the rise of CAFOs?
It's pretty easy economics. Right now, milk prices fell to a little bit over $14 a hundredweight, and that's farm talk for 100 pounds of milk, which is about 12 gallons, to put it in terms that city folk understand. So for 12 gallons of milk, a farmer now gets about $15. The price did drop as low as 14 something. It costs a family farmer about $17 or $18 to produce those 12 gallons of milk, and they're selling it for 15. So and 100 pounds of milk is about what a good cow gives in a day. So they're losing $2 every day on what every one of their cows gives. It's simple economics. They have the screws put to them. The huge industrial operations can produce 100 pounds of milk for about $12. One of the reasons is what fancy economists like to call externalities. They shove some of their expenses off to others in the communities around them. For example, waste cleanup and environmental degradation and contamination. They don't pay for the harm that they do to the neighbors' wells. They don't pay for the fact that, and I've seen it with my own eyes, people turn on a water faucet and what comes out is brown and smells like cow manure. And I had not a farm family, but a rural small town family send me a video of their shower. They took a 15-second video of their shower. They turned on the water, and what came out was brown, and they showed it circling the drain of the tub. That's what they have to shower in or bathe in. That's what comes out of their water faucet. That's what's been done by these massive industrial feedlots, but those feedlots don't have to pay for any of that. That cost is shifted to the broader community as a whole. If they had to pay for proper manure handling, if they had to pay for that environmental cleanup, they could not produce milk for $12 for 100 pounds of milk. So, because they operate on such a vast scale, they've been able to get their costs down to about $12 a hundredweight, and they get 15 for the milk. That's profitable. And the family farmer is producing it at $17 or $18 a hundredweight and getting $15 for those 12 gallons of milk. The numbers just add up in a way that it means we're going to full industrialization of agriculture unless there's intervention by our society to rescue family farmers.
So I have interest in talking to some of these voters and asking them, what are your issues, and listening to them. There are a number of barriers, it seems, like I don't know any of them. And they might be, more than an hour drive. I don't know where to go, and I don't know if they want to talk to me. And I don't know if this is going to do any good anyway. So could you talk to me about some of these barriers that I'm maybe imagining, or whether they're real?
No, those are not imaginary barriers. Those are very real. And there's not only a physical distance between us, but there's a sort of a cultural gulf between us as well. And there again, it's where I consider it a tremendous blessing to have lived a life with feet in both worlds. I still to this day have family in the farming business. I have family running a Century Farm down in Rock County along the Illinois border. And so I have no problem just wandering out to a farm, talking to a farmer, and I can kind of get into farm lingo really quickly. I actually know what $15 a hundredweight means, and that's a big advantage. But here's a suggestion. Reach out to a group like the Wisconsin Farmers Union. First of all, Wisconsin Farmers Union shares your politics. They are very pro-family farmer. They are very progressive in their politics. And we did something up in La Crosse. We were kind of wrestling with that same thing that you're wrestling with. And so were people in the city of La Crosse. and they were wanting to talk with farmers. And so I just reached out to some farmers I knew and said, would you be willing to come into the city of La Crosse and meet with a bunch of people? And our idea was just to put some city folk in the same room with a bunch of farmers and let them talk to each other. And we had the farmers on a panel sharing some of their thoughts and their reflections on their own lives out on the farm. And then they got peppered with questions from all the people who came from the city of La Crosse. And we packed the room. I was hoping for 15 or 20 or 30 people, and we had space for upwards of 100, and we had standing room only. And it was such a cool thing to see it. And one of the participants was Darren Von Ruden, who's president of the Wisconsin Farmers Union. He actually is an active farmer in Westby, the same community as this farmer who just went out of business that I posted the Facebook article about. And so Darren was part of the conversation. And one of the things that Darren said to the group is, look, we need good consumers who realize the value of milk that is not produced in these vast industrial operations, but it costs a little bit more to produce milk the right way, the way that we're doing it as family farmers. We need consumers who recognize the value of that. And he says, I want cheap products as much as anybody. We're living on the edge financially. I want cheap milk or cheap food too. But in the end, if you want something for nothing, you eventually wind up with nothing. And that's really stuck with me. That was his message to this group, is that if you want something for nothing, you eventually wind up with nothing. And I think we're fast on the road to reaching the point where we're going to get nothing of value from our model of agriculture. We're going to have these costs of production imposed on communities. The waste is going to be exported to the neighbors who are not dairy farmers, but are going to live with the fact that they're drinking contaminated water and bathing and showering in it. And so that's a suggestion, is reach out to the Wisconsin Farmers Union, because, as Darren said, farmers need people like you. They need consumers who are willing to maybe pay just a little bit more to get food grown the right way or produced the right way. And so they're anxious to have those kinds of conversations too. So I think the interesting thing is that you've got people living in the city who would like to talk to some people out in the rural areas, but you got rural people who also would really like to give a piece of their mind to the people in the city, and yet the two groups never meet. So what we tried in La Crosse was to convene create a setting where the two sides could come together and have a conversation. And I think people really valued it. And I bet you Wisconsin Farmers Union would be open to brainstorming with y'all about how to recreate that. Because there are farmers not far away from us where we sit tonight. They're right outside of town doing business, trying to make a living. Yeah.
Can you help us understand, I think, the critique of government by rural folks?
Yeah.
The situations that they see. How come they don't blame the Republican Party that has been in power in this state for quite a long time now? Why do they keep re-electing the people who are not allowing communities to discipline the CAFOs, etc.?
I think, and again, rural voters are not monolithic.
Right.
They're not all the same. But I think many rural voters do blame the Republicans for a lot of things. And I would go so far as to say, I think most rural voters don't have much use for the Republican Party. They actually dislike it with a pretty considerable passion. They just hate Democrats more. And so, rural voters are really frustrated because they don't feel they have a meaningful choice. They don't feel that they have any party that they can turn to that will really be serious about trying to address rural concerns. But again, when they are faced with two parties that they don't think give a damn about them or their lives or their livelihoods, then their default option still ends up being the party that says it's committed to limited government and lower taxes, and that's the Republican Party's marketing. So I think when they look at one side and say, I don't like them, they look at the other side and say, I really hate them, then they go back and they say, I guess I'll just go with the party that says that they are for limiting government, because that's the best I can hope for out of this deal. But I think it's a mistake to conclude that they actually support the Republican Party or like the Republican Party. They just really hate Democrats. But that's the curious thing. My dad revered Democrats. Now why? Why did my dad, who grew up amidst in the same place that today's Republican voters are living, why did he revere Democrats? Because Democrats had shown him that they would really do something for people living in places like where he was living. And I think that right there is a big secret. So I don't believe that there's great love for Trump out there. There was great hatred of the Democrats and of Hillary Clinton, but I don't think when here's an example of what I'm talking about. Two people, different days, different places, two separate men, both approached me at events where I was speaking, when I was a candidate for governor. They came up and they both introduced themselves the exact same way. They both extended the hand and said, hello, I'm a deplorable. That's a hell of a way to start a conversation. And this was two separate days, two separate places, two separate men. They both introduced themselves as the deplorables. I didn't take the bait. I didn't acknowledge that they were talking about Trump. I didn't start talking to them about Trump. I took a different tack. I asked them where they were from and what kind of work they did. And when they said where they were from or what kind of work they did, there was something in my family background that I had in common with them. Well, my dad did that kind of work, or I have family living there. That got us talking. And one thing led to another. We had them, here these two deplorables, had probably hour-long conversations with me, and we found more common ground between us than I think any of us imagined was possible. I don't think they thought they had anything in common with me. I probably didn't think I was going to agree with them about anything. We found more common ground than we imagined possible. And at the end, they decided to stay for my entire remarks. You all know where I'm coming from politically. Probably a lot of you heard me speak before. You know what my message sounds like. They came up, both of them came up to me afterwards and said, one of them said, you know, I didn't agree with everything you said, but you actually made a lot of sense. That came from a Trump voter, a deplorable. One of them did tell me that he had voted for Bernie Sanders and then turned around and voted for Trump. And so the other didn't, no two are alike. It was really fascinating to me that when what were they trying to do? Were they trying to pick a fight? Were they just trying to needle me? Were they trying? They knew I was running as a Democrat, so they figured, you know, if I introduce myself as a deplorable, it's going to create this big fight, and that's what they were looking for. Who knows what their motivation was? But by the end, they decided to listen to what I had to say, and we had some really pleasant conversations. And what I got out of both of those conversations is they had no great love for Trump. They thought they wished he could get the hell off Twitter. He had a big mouth, and he embarrassed the country in so many different ways. But still, when they would balance it all and think about all of their interests and all their the way they're thinking, they both had decided in the end that they were going to vote for Trump. My only remaining question was how much of their decision was shaped by that one remark that Hillary Clinton made. There again, that's why I ask you to challenge people when you hear that kind of thinking. Ask them about 2008 and 2012 and Barack Obama's victories in all those rural counties. Because when Hillary Clinton said these people are deplorables, they're irredeemable, they heard that and they thought, why the hell should we possibly vote for a party who would put a candidate up who thinks that way about us? And that's just human nature 101. Insulting people is no way to get their support. And that's exactly what so many all of these people who made these comments in public. I got farm family who are Facebook friends of mine. They can read this stuff. And they're thinking, that's what people think of us. To hell with them. I don't want to be part of such a party. And there, I think, of course, I don't know for sure, but I think that alone has a lot to do with why they hate Democrats with such a passion now. And that's a party that used to be revered by somebody like my father, my mother. They were FDR all the way.
Okay, so you made it just answered it, but I just want to, I want to find out if there's another answer also. So is that why, you just said that farmers are having lots of problems with the industrial farms because they're not cleaning up messes and, we already know they're environmental hazards and all that sort of thing. Yet, it's a main claim of, Democratic liberal ideology to address those issues.
Hold on. Keep in mind that Democrats have occasionally been in power. And when Jim Doyle was governor, and he had Democrats controlling both houses of the legislature.
I've only been in 4 years, sorry, since I won.
Well, and I didn't say hold on because I'm trying to disparage the question. It's just really important to.
No, I just don't know Jim Doyle.
Jim Doyle was Democratic governor of Wisconsin, and in 2009 and 2010, he had Democratic majorities in both houses of the legislature. They pushed through budget actions and legislation that expanded industrialization of agriculture. They paved the way for more CAFO. They were pro-CAFO. So again, CAFO, which is it's an acronym that stands for Concentrated Animal Feedlot Operation, and CAFO. That's just a slang term for these gigantic industrial agricultural operations. 5,000 cows, 50,000 hogs. And when there was a Democratic administration and Democratic legislature, they took pro-CAFO actions. They helped industrialize agriculture.
Well, I want to say that.
And then when Obama was president, and for a time had a Democratically controlled Congress, they weren't pushing farm policy that was trying to get agriculture steered back in the direction of sustainable family-owned operations. And so people in those rural communities aren't as stupid as city people think they are. They're thinking Republicans are okay with us drinking this water. Democrats are okay with us drinking this water. It doesn't seem that anybody in any party in the government gives us a damn about what we're dealing with out here. So again, it gets them back to that idea, do I want to vote for the party who calls us irredeemable and deplorable? Or do I want to vote for the party that seems like the party of government? Or do I want to vote for the party that at least doesn't insult us that way? Probably isn't going to do a doggone thing to help us, but at least says that it'll commit to less government and more taxes, and that's the best we can do. And I think there's logic there that you may not agree with, or that might frustrate you, but there's logic to that thinking that I think we don't give credit for. They're not stupid people in there, and they do understand their interests.
I just want to make a point for coming up on 8 o'clock, that's when our meeting is, so 2 minutes.
And just give me the hook, you want to give me the hook. Yeah.
I want to tell you, I voted for you in the primary. I contributed to your campaign. And I did not vote for Trump or Hillary Clinton. I voted in my conscience. But I disagree with some of the things you said.
That's okay.
Because the internet and broadband are not in rural areas because they are private enterprises. And those private enterprises decided they don't want to go there because they won't make any money. Are
They do know that.
Okay, then why are they blaming the government?
But again, let's,
Wait,
well, let me just answer that one. Go back to rural electrification. There's no way on earth that electric companies were going to take power lines out to every barn and every farmhouse across the country to get a few extra customers. It made no economic sense. There would still be vast swaths of America without electricity unless there had been a national effort, the Rural Electrification Act, that was a national effort to bring electricity to places that otherwise would not get it. We need the same thing, we need the exact same thing for broadband, for rural internet and mobile phone service, because it doesn't make any sense for a telecom to erect a tower or string the fiber optic or do whatever it takes to get internet access out to a few extra households. It doesn't make economic sense for those private companies. So it will take a huge state or national effort to make that happen. Neither party has shown any interest in committing to that. So again, rural people look at it and say, they don't care about this, they don't care about this, so I guess the best we can do is just keep government small.
Well, okay. I'll admit that I grew up in the inner city of Detroit, and I'm urban well all my life. But that was a socialist program, or that's what it would be called. So that's another topic. Then the other thing I wanted to mention was the price of the milk. Who sets the price of the milk?
Well, it's a combination of free market forces and now pretty limited government intervention. There used to be a far more robust role, and if you look at places like Canada, let me finish.
All right.
If you look at Canada, they have a price management system in place that could be embraced in the United States, but again, neither party has shown any interest in that either. I guarantee you that an awful lot of farmers, if a party came down in favor of a Canadian-style price management system for milk production and other commodities, they would think, now they're starting to speak our language. Now they are showing some evidence of actually caring about us. But you mentioned the word socialist. I think it's a huge mistake to assume that people in rural areas would be against what are effectively socialist policies. Again, there were Trump voters who voted for a man who openly calls himself a democratic socialist. But what they heard from Bernie Sanders made them think that could actually bring a little progress to our area. I could go for that. And when he was not the nominee, they thought, we're going to take a flyer on this Trump guy. Maybe the tariffs will help. I doubt it, but maybe. I haven't heard a better idea.
So we're going to wrap it up.
know that we subsidize that price of milk. We the taxpayers subsidize that price. And you didn't talk about that.
All right, so let's finish up the meeting.
And the roads is also a problem.
I'm sure Mike will be
They are.
after the, Okay,
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mike. Take the sign pretty quickly.